It's time for this week's episode of Brandon Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege to interview Ryan Stacy, who is the owner and host of Hockey Minds podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Brandon. How are you?
I'm doing good. Can you talk about how you knew that you wanted to start a hockey podcast?
Yeah, so honestly, when starting out, I didn't really know that the podcast was going to kind of build up to the level it has, or didn't even know if that was something I wanted to dive into. But personally, I'd always been interested in the game, and my background in school was in sport management. So I've continually been able to work in different junior levels with different programs, working with players on a daily basis, and I've always been interested in seeing how it could translate to the professional level. So one of the things I always like to do is talk with people, kind of like me and you are doing today, just having a conversation about different topics. And when COVID kind of happened last year in early March in Newfoundland and in Canada and a lot of North America, really around that time, everybody was kind of stuck at home, and I wasn't able to do the things that I like to do on a daily basis, like get to the rink and helping develop players and watching videos. So basically what I did was took it as an opportunity that maybe I could reach out to different people at any level because, as people know in the industry, there's not a lot of downtime, but a COVID break or a pandemic halting everything really does open up an opportunity where that, for a high majority of those people, they're really stuck at home wondering what to do at the moment. So I kind of took it as an opportunity to reach out to some new people and was fortunate enough to get some emails and some numbers of some NHL general managers and was very fortunate. I reached out to majority of the teams in the NHL. There's obviously some people I couldn't get in contact with, but was able to talk with somewhere between 10 and 15. I can't remember the exact number. And they did pretty much just all their guidance in hockey and hockey operations. And I never recorded those calls out of respect. And my friends kind of caught wind that I was having these conversations and they were wondering, okay, what did this person say? You're talking with this general manager in Canada. What did he say about his team? And I wasn't going to reveal some of the trade secrets for sure. But at the same time, I thought maybe it's an interesting idea to create a platform, maybe to have these conversations. And it might not be NHL general managers because of their contracts, but could be people at the lower levels because everybody has something to offer. And there's always something to learn. I know I learn a lot through those conversations. So that's kind of how the podcast came into play. And it was really just out of a hobby and out of something I like to do. And maybe a perfect storm with the COVID break. And, it really took life of its own lately, but it's been a fun experience. And anytime you can talk hockey or talk sports, I think it's something I really enjoy.
That's amazing. How did you come up with the name of your podcast, Hockey Minds?
Yeah, I think anytime you're starting a business, and I know I tried to start some small ones when I was younger and they didn't really work out, obviously, but it's always tough to come up with a name and something that sticks. And really, when I was thinking about the podcast, I kind of thought about what is it that I really want to uncover? Is it trade secrets? Do I want to understand kind of the path that people took to their careers? And all these things really interest me. But at the end of the day, I really want to understand what these people think and what's kind of going on inside their brains, inside their minds. And that's really how the Hockey Minds name was born. I did some research to see what other podcasts had been named, and nothing really tied into that. So thought it was a thing that clicked and something that would pique the interest of people who really want to get that behind the scenes and very detailed approach in terms of people and how they view the game. So that's really how the Hockey Minds name started, and I've been fortunate to keep it going ever since.
Of course, whenever it comes to the name of your podcast, Hockey Minds, whenever you do interview, let's say GMs or people in a hockey, do you do you go like deep inside like how they got started and stuff like that?
Yeah, I definitely want to give people a full picture because you can look at, again, let's say someone works for the Montreal Canadiens. Well, obviously they work with the Montreal Canadiens because somewhere along the way, either they met someone important and built a relationship, or they they prove themselves, whether it be at the AHL level, maybe the college level, major, junior, wherever it may be. But what people often have a hard time figuring out is how do they get to that level? There's not as much about the first steps and how you kind of transition into the hockey operations industry. So generally on my interview, what I do is offer all my guests an opportunity to talk about their background, really where they're from, and kind of talk about their um, maybe involvement in minor hockey or other sports. A lot of times it's not actually hockey that kind of piques their interest in the sports industry. So we always go through those steps and then really talk about the entry to the game, just so that people can get a better perspective on what it takes early on to make it into industry, and maybe develop their own blueprint on how to make that next step based on what the guests and other people in the industry have done before them.
What are some of the segments that you have on your podcast?
Generally, I try to keep it almost in a single segment, just a very open interview, and I don't edit a whole lot out of that, if I'm being honest, outside of a few things that might come up, that interfere with contracts and different things along those lines. But generally, I try to break it up into your early experiences where you talk about your childhood, your background, then your transition into the game. Then we go into your career as a whole, go through each step and talk about the different positions and organizations you've been with. Then we move into more of an opinion-based question period where we'll just go over different topics that might relate to experiences you've had, whether it's working international hockey, or if you're a video coach, talking about some of the things that you deal with in that field respectively. And then we go into more reflective where you talk about mentors, things you've learned, and final advice. So really it's one general conversation that people generally listen to in the interview, but I do tend to break it up into a couple of little segments just to keep it organized and allow people to get all perspectives of these people and their careers in the industry.
Can you talk about, of course, how you go about getting the people that you've had on your show? For example, do you use LinkedIn a lot?
Yeah, it's definitely not a cookie cutter process. Sometimes you use LinkedIn, and people who know me know I'm an advocate for LinkedIn, and I think it's a great tool for connecting with people, whether it's through the podcast or just for general advice and information. And I have people always reaching out to me with questions as well about my experiences, whether it's through the podcast or working with teams in junior hockey. So I think that's a really good platform and something that I use pretty much on a daily basis. Aside from that, I also like to use Twitter. I find for the hockey community specifically, I don't know as much about the other industries just because my focus has always been hockey in that regard. Twitter is a great way to connect and meet new people, especially in the analytics community. That's a given there. But outside of that, I also rely a lot on my connections, just from personal meetings in the rinks or former guests, referring me to new people. I get a conversation started via that platform or that route almost every day. So it's there's a lot of different avenues for connecting with people, but I find when you have a purpose and you go about the right way, you can meet a lot of great people, even if you don't have the means to meet them face to face all the time.
Who are some of the notable guests that you have had on your podcast?
I mean, there's been a lot of different guests, and the term notable in terms of what I do with the Hockey Minds podcast can mean a lot of different things. I think it ultimately comes down to your own interest, as I try to get people in different positions. If you mean notable in terms of their high level of success, you can look at some of the guests I've had recently. My last guest here a couple of days ago was Lynn Zofford. He was the assistant general manager and director of scouting with the Arizona Coyotes, and was also a director with the Leafs scouting staff for a while back. Mike Johnston was a guest of mine as well. He coached the Pittsburgh Penguins, and also coached with the Vancouver Canucks. We have people at all different levels who've been scouts, managers, and some of them prefer to stay in junior hockey and been tenured managers there for 15, 20 years, or have been college coaches for 15, 20 years. So at the end of the day, there might not be a perfect answer for my biggest guests, but I can guarantee if there's something you're interested in or a level of hockey that you're interested in, you can probably find it on the podcast. And to be honest with you, if you haven't found it and there's something you'd like to hear about, whether it's a team executive or a specific person in the game, you can reach out to me and I'll do my best to kind of cover that area or get that person specifically.
Of course, I know that you said that you talked to a lot of like NHL people that work in there, but have you reached out to any college like hockey coaches?
Yeah, you definitely look to cover all areas. In terms of college coaches, one of my recent guests was Dave Smith. He's the head coach at RPI Division One school. Bob Duraney is a well tenured Division One and now Division Three coach who will be on at a future episode. But I definitely like to tie in coaches who work at the college level, and I even notice that a lot of times if I have coaches who are working maybe major junior or the ECHL, AHL, they still often tie into college somehow. So that's one of the great things, that even if a guest is working in a certain position, chances are, the last 15, 20 years, they probably crossed over 6 or 7 different leagues. And I think that offers an interesting perspective as well.
What was your experience like joining the Hockey Network?
Yeah, the Hockey Podcast Network was really a great opportunity for me. And I think before I was with them, the podcast was really just a hobby, and I wasn't too well versed on the technical side and kind of setting up and some of the social media tactics. I think I was getting better at, but I still need a little bit of guidance. And the network really just took it to a new level and really setting me up on the proper platforms and giving me some guidance in terms of how to approach social media. And you learn from other people in the network as well. Every day they're having conversations, and sometimes it's just banter on a different topic in the game, or other times it could be something that's a little more detailed. But I think, in terms of my podcast, it has been a huge for me in growing the brand, something I look forward to continuing to be a part of moving forward.
Of course, with the joining the network and stuff, can you talk a little bit about how that has helped you? Have they gave you some guests, or have you looked for your own guests?
Personally, just with my area, hockey operations, again, I generally have to go through my own connections. So they've definitely offered me the opportunity to have guests on the podcast, whether it's other hosts or other people in the industry. And I know for a lot of the team specific shows, they do a really great job of creating those connections where possible. But for me, it's more so been my own connections. But the podcast network, of course, as in terms of the process and the quality of the show and editing and adding in sponsors and all these different areas that behind the scenes really make a show what it is at the end of the day. I think they've been really beneficial, and working together with my connections and their process, it's made for a really great podcast at the end of the day.
What is something that you learn now that you didn't know before starting?
I think the biggest thing is that there's so many ways to get involved in the game and so many ways to be successful. There's a narrative in hockey that you have to be a professional player to have any kind of success on the management side. And we go through each and every guest that I have, and yes, some of them have playing careers and utilize that as it may be. But there's so many different routes, and you don't have to be a player. Personally, I was a house league player, and I like to think that my mind was pretty good, but my feet definitely didn't match the capabilities of that. So I kind of had to go a non-traditional route. But you really see a lot of people succeeding in the industry with a non-traditional background, and for me it's inspiring, and maybe gives me and other listeners on the podcast hope that if you do things the right way and take a different approach in the game, you can still be successful. And who knows, maybe at the end of the day you can be a general manager or a top level executive at the NHL level.
What are some of your future plans with the Hockey Minds podcast?
Really just to continue to grow it. And people always talk about growing in terms of listeners, but I think I relate more so to having people involved. Recently I released the Hockey Minds newsletter, which is really just a newsletter for people to share their ideas. I might write a few things for it, but really I just want people who are listening, and maybe they're students, maybe they're lower level coaches, and maybe they're experienced coaches. They have the opportunity as well, but they can really just share their ideas and have a platform to get their thoughts out and maybe connect with a future employer or create a new connection. And that's something that really, in terms of growing the podcast, excites me. But I really want to bring on new guests, maybe get to another level in some of our guests, and while still keeping the connection to, the junior C, the junior B, tier 2, tier 3, division 3, all these people that have really made the podcast successful. And I think it's important to continue to share all levels of the game through the podcast. So, with that and the website and all the things, and even my Hockey Minds conference, which will be happening this June, a virtual event, there's a lot going on, and I'm really excited to see how far we can take it and how many people can get involved and grow in the hockey community.
That's so amazing. What advice would you give upcoming future people looking to start their own hockey podcasts?
Honestly, just do it and put yourself out there. A lot of people like the idea of starting a podcast or doing some kind of information sharing, but if you only get 30, 40 listeners, and that's really great. That's 30, 40 people that are learning something new or being entertained by your podcast. But if they don't see the numbers of a brand like Spitting Chicklets or the 31 Thoughts podcast or some major podcasts in the other sports, they feel like it's not worth it, and they're not making money. But at the end of the day, it's really just a hobby and something that you do because you enjoy meeting new people and having these conversations. And if you can make money along the way, well, great. That's an awesome opportunity for you. And I encourage you to follow that avenue. But, just put yourself out there and put your own unique spin on things, because at the end of the day, you might get lucky. And, I always tell people my goal with the podcast was 2 episodes a month and 50 listeners. And we're now at 2 episodes a week. And I can tell you that the listeners are much, much higher than that.
That's amazing and wonderful. Where can my listeners find your podcast at on social media and podcast platforms?
Yeah, honestly, wherever you look, you can probably find the podcast if you're looking well enough. The HockeyMindsPodcast.com is my website. That's my home base for all my information. You can find my episodes there, links to different platforms, guests, information. The Hockey Minds Conference is all there. Additionally, you can look on Twitter and Instagram at HockeyMindsPod. We share a lot of stuff there. We're also on Facebook and LinkedIn if you look at those platforms as well. I know they're not as widely used, but they're also there. And then in terms of finding it on actual podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, pretty much any platform that you look on, you should be able to find it. And if you do have a podcast platform that you like to use and you're having trouble finding my podcast, by all means, reach out to myself or the Hockey Podcast Network, and we'll make sure that we get on that platform as well.
That's amazing. Thank you again, Ryan, for your interview, and best of luck with your podcast, Hockey Minds.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Brandon, and thank you for having me on the show today. And I've watched some of your interviews to date, and I wish you all the best moving forward with future interviews as well.
Thank you. You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Facebook at Brandon Sports Talk, Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Ryan, for your interview, and best of luck with your Hockey Minds podcast.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.